terms of taking up less space. I think that's fairly clear. There's probably different access barriers. They're cheaper than car ownership, but there's maybe physical access barriers and the emissions are lower. However, and I'm sure this is what we'll be discussing over the next hour, there are concerns about safety. And I think one of the other concerns that has been expressed is that they may take journeys away from walking and cycling rather than from cars. But I think some of that is really about design and how we design our cities and how we offer e-scooters rather than the e-scooter itself. So yes, to answer the question, yes, they are very interesting and we should discuss them and work out how best to integrate them in our cities.
Janelle, as somebody who works for an e-scooter company, I guess I know your answer, but what are your views on the subject?
Yes, absolutely. But also, I mean, the way that we think about e-scooters is that e-scooters are not this revolution to transport or mobility. They're not there to replace every other type of mobility. What they are is just one additional piece of the puzzle to shift the way we think about mobility, right? So what we actually see as the more ingenious part about e-scooters is that it shifts the way people think about moving. Actually, you know, historically, transport in cities is kind of divided into these two buckets of private mobility, which is associated with cars, and collective mobility, which is associated with public transport. And there's this new area, which is shared mobility, which represents like an entire new world of thinking about the way you move. So it's not a part of your planned day. It's now an experience that you go through during the day. It's now on demand. There's now, you don't need to have this heavy overhead expense as a private person to own a car if there's additional ways that you can move for a much more affordable solution. And the benefit about e-scooters is that they're actually very easy to learn and they're very easy to adopt. So the friction of trying to integrate a new form of shared mobility through the avenue of e-scooters is a really nice one, because it means that there's this kind of low entry barrier to shifting the way people think about movement. And this is really where the exciting and ingenious part comes in for us.
And thanks for that. And by magic, Nick Rawlings is here. Hello, Nick, how are you?
I'll let you carry on for the minute, Ed, and I'll take over when you've done the first question.
Yeah, we've just popped through the first question. We've got everybody's views on the opener from the Transport Committee's views. So I'll just remind everybody again, 2 ways to get involved, through the chat function and through the raising your hand. And I'll just pose the second question now while Nick settles in. The Transport Committee report also called for robust enforcement measures to deter the use of e-scooters on pavements. And I think that's obviously one of the key issues which has arisen by a number of the trials that are already going on. Is this realistic? And if not, how can e-scooterists be persuaded to stay off pavements? And I'll ask first to Janelle, if you want to come in first on that one, as well as a organisation which has, I think you're right in saying you're live in York, is that correct?
Yeah. So this is an interesting topic because one, pavement riding is not usually the illness. It's usually a symptom of a bigger problem. So is it a symptom of the fact that people don't feel safe riding on the road? Is it a symptom of the fact that people aren't informed that they're not allowed to ride? Is it a symptom of the fact that people, I don't know, feel threatened that bicycles are going faster than them, so they would prefer to go amongst walking speed people on the sidewalk? So there's a number of different factors to consider. And with pavement riding, it's especially important to understand what these underlying factors are, so you can actually solve the root cause of the problem and not just put like band-aid issues on. And another scope in which to understand this is that shared micromobility is by nature a technologically based solution. You know, we're a platform essentially with pieces of hardware on the street that we control through technical means. And this means that there's often certain expectations to be able to control things like rider behavior through technical solutions. And of course, there is definitely an onus on operators to deliver on that expectation. We should be taking absolutely every measure we can to ensure the safety of the people using our vehicles and the safety of the people around our vehicles, whether that's the visually impaired, whether it's pedestrians, whether it's cyclists, whether it's other car users, etc. But at the end of the day, pavement riding is only one part of an entire customer journey. And that whole customer journey from start to end, every single thing we do to influence customer behavior along that journey is a piece of friction that can further disincentivize the adoption of innovative forms of this type of mobility. So it's also important to see it in the bigger picture of like, what is where we really want to add the most value by incorporating technological solutions? Is it something like pavement riding, where we technologically ban people from going on pavement riding? Or do we want to complement that actually with education, with understanding how to change behaviors and so on? Because we wouldn't, for example, put up cage fences to limit people from jaywalking. So why do we think that that's a normal thing to go to like the extreme version with something like pavement riding? So pavement riding for us is really something that has to be addressed. It's really important. E-scooters are not for pavements. Pavements are for people. Pavements are for society to live and thrive and be happy and have space, and for children to run and people to walk their dogs and so on. It's not a space for e-scooters. So how can we really understand all those different nodes that are contributing to why people do it, and tackle those things, especially through education, behavior change, and then complement that with certain technological solutions or even manual solutions, like having street patrol teams that educate people on the pavement, educating shop owners perhaps to communicate to their customers that use e-scooters and so on.
Thank you. You happy for me to take over, Ed?
Nick, fire away. It's the role.
Relax. Yeah, good. So Graham, what's your take on this issue of riding on pavements?
Yeah, I building on really what Janelle said, I think it's clearly a serious issue and one we want to avoid. And this is one technology where I guess we can actually use things like geofencing to almost physically stop people using pavements, because we can, forgive me for not extending or understanding all technology, but you can use the geofence to shut the motor off when you're on a pavement. And you can use incentives, so you can give people extra points for free rides if they ride responsibly, or cancel people's membership if it's a rental scheme. However, I don't think it's an entirely technological question. I think this actually comes down to all the things that Janelle was mentioning about awareness and education and behaviour change, but also city planning. We need to look at this in terms of how we plan our cities as a whole. So why do people why do people cycle on pavements, and why do people use e-bikes, e-scooters on pavements? Is primarily, I think, because they don't feel confident cycling on the roads. So how can we make sure that there's attractive environments on which to use e-scooters? And I would therefore turn the enforcement angle round and point it at cars and drivers, because that's the vehicle that primarily makes people feel unsafe. So the question for enforcement is not just about e-scooters, but about how we ensure good driving practices. So how we enforce speed limits and other driving offences, and make sure that we provide an environment that people can confidently use an e-scooter in.
David, what's your take on this?
I think it's a fascinating answer so far. It is obviously a multifaceted issue.
Big problem as well, isn't it?
It is a big problem. I think, quite honestly, it's possibly the biggest problem.
Yes.
I mean, there is obviously the issue of rider safety, but the concerns that have been raised mostly have been from pedestrians, and particularly the partially sighted or blind pedestrians who feel most vulnerable.
Yes.
And we've seen the rental scheme in Coventry suspended pretty soon after it was introduced. And I don't know if it's yet resumed. It may have just resumed, but they have banned e-scooters there from the city centre. And obviously the geofencing solution has not been adequate, unless that's the way they're banning them. There was a suggestion it was just due to sort of terrible behaviour in Coventry. I can't believe people of Coventry are worse than anywhere else, or better than anywhere else, in that respect. So I think it's not to be underestimated.
No.
And in the sense of, responding to Graham's point about city planning, sure, there is a bit of city planning involved, but Coventry has been planned as a pedestrian area. So evidently it's convenient to ride an e-scooter through that in some circumstances. There's probably some cyclists as well, but I think that, it's definitely an issue. The other thing I'd just like to say here is that the Select Committee said two things. Firstly, e-scooters should, three things. Firstly, legalise e-scooters.
Yes.
Secondly, make sure they're not used on pavements. And thirdly, they shouldn't compete with active travel, or at least try not to.
Yes.
I think that's what we might come on to, more difficult. But in regard to pavement use, there was a problem in Coventry. The rental scheme was closed down.
Yeah.
So there's a solution. I mean, not a perfect one, but they're working on it. What we have now is about 300,000 privately owned e-scooters in the UK. Christmas is coming up. The companies who are selling these things legally are evidently not pointing out too keenly to their customers that these things are illegal to use. And that actually is much more my concern than TIA, which is backed by good people like Janelle. The regulations, and Ed, and Nick, your road safety education is your blood. It's not easy persuading people to stick to the laws, whether they're drivers or cyclists or motorcyclists or whatever. And we're talking about a lot of teenagers at the moment who are using e-scooters privately, illegally.
Yeah.
It is just completely illegal at the moment. So pointing out to them it's illegal to use it on the pavement doesn't actually make a lot of difference. So, the police haven't got the resources. So I don't know how that aspect of the Select Committee's report will be achieved, particularly in regard to private use.
Yeah. Does anyone on the panel actually think that more enforcement would solve the problem? Is that realistic in the current environment where the police are already stretched? And is it realistic, Janelle, to think that the police are going to enforce offences committed by e-scooterists? Because I'm not sure it is.
Yeah, so there's two sides to this coin. A responsible e-scooter operator should have a team of people on the streets every day, almost all day, right? Because it's our responsibility as well to educate our people. So there's kind of law enforcement, and then there's e-scooter operator enforcement. The benefit of law enforcement is that it comes with a credibility that there is certain punishment that comes attached to it. When it comes from an e-scooter operator, a customer doesn't know, well, is the e-scooter operator saying that because it's actually illegal, or are they saying that because it's just bad behavior? Are they just trying to disincentivize me, and so on? So there's a lot of clarity that comes with enforcement from police. But where we've actually seen that it comes the best is if you work collaboratively between the operator and the police. So having, for example, joint awareness campaigns, and the e-scooter operator using their on-street staff to be educating people. Because often, like I mentioned, it's not that everyone riding on pavement is doing it just because they feel like doing something naughty. They're doing it because there's another underlying reason. And often it's always because they don't know that they're not allowed to ride there. So if our people can take care of educating people that they're not allowed to ride there, joint efforts with the police can also do education campaigns that can also be funded partially or entirely by the operator, whether those are marketing related campaigns, on-street education campaigns, joint patrols, etc., etc. There's a lot of things that you can do to have a kind of multi-channel approach to change user behavior and also to raise awareness of this problem.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to bring the audience in at this point and find out if there's anyone who wants to comment, or if there's anything on the chat line, Ed, that we should pick up at this point.
There's a couple of comments on the chat line so far, Nick. One from Suzanne Douglas, who says, I don't think the problem is that riders feel threatened on the road. A lot of it is that they feel entitled to be on the pavements, and there is no deterrent not to be on the pavements, which is, of course, what the panelists have been saying. And a second comment from Joanne Glenn, who says, why is there no TV campaign explaining private e-scooters are illegal in the run up to Christmas? Which again, I guess, touches on the comments that have been made so far.
It's a good point, actually. It's a good because the problem we got, of course, is, as David says, we've got responsible operators like TIA and the other major players, and then we've got the scooters being sold to private individuals who have to, if they're going to use them on the roads, it's illegal. End of story. And I guess there's a bit of a conflict there, isn't there, between the commercial interests of people wanting to sell them and the fact they're not legal to be used. But do your company sell them privately, Janelle?
We do in Germany.
Okay, not in the UK.
Privately in the UK, and we also wouldn't until the national regulation makes it legal to sell e-scooters, but our primary business is shared e-scooters. Joanne, on your point around TV campaigns or other kind of campaigns, I do think that it's educating the broader public about this from an authority level that has the right to do that is really important. So whether that's the DFT or local authority councils, etc., the onus is on that. Where the UK cities stand on permitting the sale of private e-scooters to appease the commercial interests versus forbidding the use of those private e-scooters because maybe people want to take it to their, I don't know, country home or something. You don't really know what the uses for the e-scooter are, so maybe forbidding purchasing isn't the right approach, but educating should definitely come from an authoritative position. And also, one thing about the GPS point that we touched upon a little bit earlier that I would like to explain here. So there's certain limitations with GPS. I'm not too sure how familiar everybody is with it, but GPS generally can only assure accuracy up to 25 meters. And GPS is impacted by the positioning of the satellites as well as the type of buildings around. So if there's high-rise buildings with a lot of glass, the GPS signal bounces everywhere. So a customer might be exactly where they're supposed to be, but GPS is picking up that they're 50 meters away. And that creates some confusion. So it depends on the landscape, it depends on the cityscape, it depends on the building materials that are being used, it depends on the positioning of the satellites, etc., to optimize the location positioning. There is a number of innovative technologies out there, and e-scooter companies that can implement their own IoT or Internet of Things boxes into their e-scooters, which is something TIER is currently developing. They can have much more accurate control of e-scooters positioning, because we're not limited by a third party's kind of walls of technological limitations.
Sure.
So it depends on what spectrum you are of being able to use your own technology in your vehicles versus needing to use third-party providers' technology in your vehicles, improves accuracy of the vehicle. And GPS is not the only type of technology you can use for vehicle positioning.
Yeah.
There's also, for example, like camera positioning data, and there's metadata in photos and so on. So there's a number of data points that you can use to optimize the positioning of scooters. Some of it only serves for parking, some of it serves for actually being used during the ride. Sometimes GPS is actually really accurate, like our GPS often has accuracy of 2 meters. So it depends. There's other factors to consider here, but generally GPS isn't good enough for pavement riding.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Ed, there's a couple more comments cropped up on the chat line. Do you want to just cover them off before we move on to another subject?
Yeah, I'll just read the one from Neil Holland, which says, I agree that some users may feel entitled to use the pavement, but quality provision for cycling and scooting will encourage more people to use this instead of pavements. I'm a confident road cyclist, but do not feel safe using an e-scooter through some of the busy roads and junctions local to me.
Yeah, interesting.
And we have a question, a further question from John Bowman, who says, should sellers be licensed to sell e-scooters? If so, should part of the agreement be to contribute towards an advertising campaign?
Interesting thought.
Can I chip in there?
Yeah, of course.
We've written to the Minister, Rachel McLean, regarding the private use, which they were particularly concerned about. And she emphasised that the Department for Transport has reminded e-scooter sellers of their responsibilities. But to be honest, the Department of Transport has very much put the responsibility back on local trading standards people and the retailers. One or two retailers like John Lewis have taken the principled decision not to sell them because they know that using them is illegal and they don't want any potential liability comeback. But if I could just comment on the idea on the chat about an TV advertising campaign. I think in these days, we don't have the budget for TV advertising, but the DFT Think campaign are very good at targeting young road users through social media. And I think e-scooter use could be a very good tailored social media campaign. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, good. Just want to change the subject, change the topic slightly, if that's okay. Not massively, but I want to talk about an interesting partnership between ROSPA and Neuron Mobility, which is another scooter provider, who are working in partnership to develop a training course for e-scooter riders. Now, I think that sounds a really good idea, but my question is really, I suppose, two things. I mean, should the government make some sort of training for e-scooters compulsory? That's the sort of CBT for scooter riders. And secondly, if it's not compulsory, who on earth is going to actually do the course that ROSPA and Neuron Mobility are, with all good intentions, setting about creating? So thoughts on that one, Graham?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I personally wouldn't make it compulsory to have a training course for e-scooters, primarily because I think there should be something that people can kind of adopt really easily and build into their own travel patterns, and kind of making it more and more formal makes that difficult to do. And there are benefits when people using these vehicles in the same way that we promote cycling. We don't make cycle training compulsory, but we do encourage, in Greater Manchester, for example, there's free cycle training available for people who want it, people who seek out and gain more confidence. I think it's really good that e-scooter hire companies are offering kind of videos and courses and so on. That's brilliant. But I wouldn't make it compulsory. What I would do is make sure that in driving tests and driving lessons, that people are educated to know about all the different vehicles that are going to be on the road. So we should be making sure that drivers are looking out for e-scooters. I would say, just an observation generally about this discussion, I think the e-scooter hire schemes and individual e-scooter ownership seem to be quite different issues, really. There's much more you can do with the hire schemes in terms of making sure people see certain information and so on. I think that it's much more challenging with the private ownership. But I think it suffers from the fact that because it's illegal, there isn't official information about how to do it safely. So I mean, I don't know how we overcome that.
David, do you support this move by ROSPA and Neuromobility, or do you think they're whistling into the wind?
No, I do support it. I mean, ROSPA has always been involved with training and education and so forth, and they're taking what we would now say is probably a realistic attitude to this whole thing. They're here. They're not going to be uninvented, disappear. Whether they're rental schemes or even more so the private use. I won't mention the company, but another company is Joint Packs, and they do e-scooter training. Actually, they do. No, I correct myself. They do scooter training and e-scooter training. And I think what people like me have to remember, that lots of youngsters now going to school go by scooter, push scooters. If that's the right term, and they've probably got better scooting balance skills than I have. I mean, I've had a go on one of the wonderful tier scooters, and it was great fun, but I did find it mildly terrifying, even though I'm a regular cyclist. I think there are skills to be learned, and that is positive, and some people will take it up, and I wouldn't make it compulsory.
Would it be the people that really need to do it that take it up, or would it be the people that probably are already responsible?
Well, I think with e-scooters, I mean, there's two aspects. One is, can you balance it so you don't fall off and injure yourself? And there is an issue about new users. They do say most people tend to have their injury within the first few goes. The second thing is your attitude, and this is like young drivers. Young drivers can operate cars perfectly safe, perfectly competently. It's just they like to go fast, so they like to take risks, and that's another matter around whether education can actually address that.
Janelle, quickly, what's your view on this training course idea?
So maybe some of you have seen yesterday, actually, TIER also announced its training course in partnership with the AA. And the reason that we have something like that is because we do think it is a good idea. We think it is important that you build a training partnership or a training course in partnership with a credible institution who has expertise in that, who has credibility and recognition amongst the public as a reputable education institution as well, because as an e-scooter operator, you just don't have that credibility within the public. So this is one part. I think it is a good idea, and ideally operators should be doing whatever they can to incentivize people to take these training courses. So it's not just we have a training course, use it if you like. It should be you get your next 2 rides for free, or we will give you a free helmet if you take this course, or whatever it is. We will give you a discounted subscription package for 1 month, etc., so that there's benefits for the customers as well, and you can reach a critical mass of people who do understand it as well. And I do agree with Graham's point about the fact that education also needs to be linked into a broader thinking. So education around the safety of e-scooter use is not just for the e-scooter rider. An e-scooter rider is only as safe as how everyone else on the road around him behaves. So it should be incorporated, for example, into car driver's license learning or motorbike license learning as well, so that those other road users are sensitive. They know how to be aware of micromobility vehicles, because it's not just e-scooters. E-scooters are one form of micromobility that's going to become a trend as the years pass. So maybe today it's e-scooters and bicycles, but in 5 years' time, we don't know what additional micromobility vehicle is out there. So generally, we need to be making the public more sensitive of smaller vehicles also taking up road space.
Yeah. Thank you. Right, now I can't believe there's no one in the audience going to come in on this point. You're education and training as publicity specialists. You really should be chomping at the bit to come in and raise your hands rather than do the cowardly thing of chat down the side. But I can't see anyone raising their hand at the moment. So Ed, do you want to give us a summary of what's said on the chat line? There's quite a bit of activity there, I notice.
Yeah, first of all, Nick, a little bit disappointed you didn't give a plug for our podcast, which is being published on Friday.
Sorry, yes. You want to do that now, do you?
Yeah, so for
the next generation taken over, everyone's realised that now.
Yeah, so for anybody who's got more interest in the ROSPA Neuron partnership, Nick and I have recorded a special podcast which is being published on Friday morning, during which they talk about their training, why they put it together, and how they intend people to incentivise people to join. But anyway, back to the session and the comments. Yeah, there's a comment from Ashley Knott at Derbyshire Police, who says, obligation on all road users to share the road safely, so anything which could improve awareness for all road users has to be good. And there's also then a separate question from Rob Wiltshire, who says, can e-scooters also not be sold with a free reflective bib or belt? I've seen a huge number of illegal e-scooter riders at night in dark clothing that have nearly got themselves killed, and I guess that's especially relevant at this time of year.
Any thoughts on that, Janelle?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting point. Maybe a way to think about it actually is to make scooters reflective, because people don't really like wearing additional things. People don't like having to put a helmet on. They don't like having to wear a reflective vest and so on. It's not with their image style or whatever the reasons are. They just took an e-scooter opportunistically, so they don't have their vest with them, etc., etc. So like something that we do, for example, in the Nordics, is we know there as well, like daylight is very limited over winter, so we actually put reflective stickers on our scooters there. And this could be a better way of thinking about it, so that the vehicle itself is always visible, because sometimes it's also parked and then it's not visible to road users who might trip over it and so on.
Yeah, it's a good idea, actually. Good suggestion that if the scooter itself was made in some way more visible, that's something people can't discard. Whereas a bib or something, they're not going to wear it, are they? Not most people, probably.
One point just to add to this, sometimes there's a bit of a regulatory caveat, is that in some countries there is limitations on the number of reflectors that are permitted on a scooter, the direction of those reflectors and the colors of those reflectors. So there is sometimes regulation forbids additional visibility reflectors.
Yeah, good. Right, okay. I want to go on now, if that's okay, to talk about the trials that are going on currently of e-scooters that are happening around the country. So I want to know really whether the panelists welcome these trials, or whether they feel they've been rushed through somewhat in the light of COVID-19, and they're therefore potentially not properly thought through. What's your views on this, David?
Well, we've gone on public record as saying that we felt the whole thing was rushed through. The government had talked about, I think it was 4 or 6 trials next year. And in fact, they've introduced almost an unlimited number this year, at very short notice, with very limited consultation. The results of the consultation have been published, and we were very surprised at the outcome, the government decision based on some of the consultation, particularly around the specification for scooters. The top speed limit, a power limit which was off the consultation scale, and a weight limit which was never envisaged. So that was of concern to us. Didn't suggest kind of a safety first principle. I think though, on the other hand, I would congratulate the government and all those taking part in the trials on entering this quite seriously, and the government has committed to the Select Committee and in the House that they will take into account the learning from the trials. They're not going to simply rush through approval of e-scooters wholesale until they've got that learning. And I think the pressure that's gone on some of the operators like TIA to come up with safety solutions and pavement parking and use solutions, has generated innovation, and I think that's quite exciting. But our biggest fear, our objection to the trials going through so quickly was it wasn't properly discussed, but also it's just ignoring the much wider problem of private use.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yes, The government are in a difficult position. I think we all acknowledge that, don't we? And we understand that there is a need to do things quickly at the moment, and so therefore, you know, on the one hand, one has to applaud the fact they have acted quite innovatively, really. But Graham, what's your view on this? You contributed towards the committee session, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I take David's point that in a way it feels rushed, but on a kind of European scale, we're not late to the party, but you know, a lot of other countries have gone ahead of us. So we've had the chance to observe what's happening in other countries and learn from that. So in that sense, it puts us in a good position. And I don't think I'm breaking any confidences by saying that in Salford we had been discussing it for quite a while. You know, with the potential of doing something around iCampus and around the Greater Manchester area. So, you know, I suspect the areas that are doing the trial will have similar positions where they've been looking at it, some of the areas at least. So, you know, I don't feel like it's come completely out of the blue, but clearly there's always more we could be doing to prepare. With the issue about private ownership, I completely agree. I mean, it's like they haven't integrated that at all, and they've seen the hire schemes as completely separate to that when it may not be possible to do that. So I think that's something that needs a lot of attention.
You know, what's the situation in Europe with privately owned scooters? How are they regulated and controlled?
The difference between privately owned scooters and shared scooters is not as stark as in the UK anywhere else in Europe. So it's not actually a problem. It's either that e-scooters become legal, whether it's shared or private, or they don't become legal. And okay. The trend is that every national government makes them legal, basically. So, and it often also comes with either developing a new category of vehicle or merging it with the vehicle classification of bicycles, which is, from our perspective, the optimal way of doing it, because people understand bicycles. So as soon as you add an additional vehicle type that should abide by the same rules as bicycles, it makes sense to classify them the same as bicycles. So I understand DFT's issue with enabling shared e-scooters during this trial period, but not permitting privately owned vehicles. It's kind of, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place to be able to meet the needs of everyone here, and the loopholes and the solutions that they could find in national regulation as it stands to permit shared e-scooters were quite a lot of pieces of a puzzle that they had to put together, and unfortunately private e-scooters couldn't fit in there. But that doesn't mean it's going to be that way in a year's time when they do revise national regulation. So one, I think it's important to think of this in the context of this is a temporary issue. This isn't a permanent issue. Yeah. Because once e-scooters do become legalized in the UK, which we're quite confident that they will, it will encompass private and shared e-scooters most likely. And everywhere else in Europe, privately owned e-scooters, they are a thing, but I think it might be a bit bigger in the UK. I don't have hard facts. This is sort of my spidey senses telling me this. And I think it's because shared e-scooters haven't been permitted there. But in mainland Europe, in most countries, there's shared e-scooters. So the need to own a private scooter isn't as great.
Okay.
Nick, can I just chip in there very quickly?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
The information I have from the Bicycle Association, many of whose members like Halfords are selling e-scooters legally, is that the UK is unique. There's nowhere else in the world, let alone, you know, as well as Europe, as Janelle said, that has this level of private scooter ownership, which is very interesting. But it does give us also a specific issue. So
you're saying it's the level of private ownership is high here?
Very high, very high.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe because other parts of the world have rental schemes, people don't feel the need to own them. I don't know, you know. But for some reason, we like buying these things in the UK.
Interesting. Ed, what's the thread on the chat line?
Well, I'm pleased to say we actually have a hand up from Nigel Lloyd Jones, so I'm going to allow him to talk and see what he has to say.
Yeah, Nigel, you're very welcome.
Good morning, good afternoon, evening, everyone. I am Priority Lead for Safe and Social Roads for the Police Crime Commissioner in Gloucestershire. Yeah. And as you know, we've been running trials in Cheltenham and Gloucester. And I'd absolutely echo what everyone's saying, that these trials were introduced without enough preparation. I think we've all learned a huge amount from it about how we need to get awareness out there into the community that these activities are going to take place, awareness about their usage, and then the whole thing about how they are policed and managed. And I take my hat off to Svings. Everyone is really now getting around this, and there's going to be a huge amount of learning. But my fundamental issue is they don't make any noise. And to me, that's the fundamental thing about electric scooters with vulnerable road users. They need to be designed to have some form of sound synthesizer so that you can hear them coming. And that, to me, is one of the most fundamental issues. So thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you. Anyone disagree with that, first of all, on the panel?
Maybe I can jump in here because this is an interesting topic. And Tier agrees with you, Nigel. So I don't know if you've seen in the last 2 weeks, perhaps we made an announcement that we will be issuing our scooters with AVA solutions. So artificial sound so that the blind and visually impaired can hear our scooters coming. This is an important topic, and it's also important that e-scooter operators recognize that they're not the sole source of truth. We don't understand actually the needs and concerns of every other road user. So it's really important that we consult with the organizations that represent other vulnerable road users or sensitive interest groups and so on. So this solution of audio-visual alerts we've developed in partnership with, for example, the Thomas Pocklington Trust.
Graham or David, do you want to comment on what Nigel said and what Janelle's response?
I think what Janelle and Tia are doing is very interesting. Maybe it should apply to bicycles as well. They can detect pedestrians. I mean, obviously, cars, buses, all motor vehicles are going to be required to have an audio warning soon. So maybe there is a technological solution to that.
Yeah.
And
Graham, anything to add?
I would like to add one point here, though, is that a huge benefit of micromobility is that they reduce noise pollution. So you have to strike the right balance between raising awareness of the vehicle and not adding a vehicle to another vehicle type to the road that is just adding to noise pollution in cities, because e-scooters and micromobility in general are one of these things that have so many environmental benefits, sustainability benefits from a cost-effective perspective for people, from an environmental perspective in terms of reducing CO2 emissions by taking people off of cars, and the noise pollution aspect. So you have to strike the right balance here. And Vicky, reading your comment about maybe on certain routes or something like that, that is an interesting thing. You can link it to certain areas that are higher risk areas. So for example, something that we do in Sweden is we've also worked with the Blind Association in Sweden to identify which are the areas that the blind population primarily live in, and we've made some of those streets no-go zones as well, so that there's other means that you can address the needs of that community over and above making the scooter audible.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point, but I also agree that noise pollution is one of the biggest issues with traffic. So, the silence is good and challenging, isn't it, really? As part of the research we're doing at Salford around our trial scheme here, we're going to be consulting with vulnerable groups, and that's something we really want to look at. So there will be solutions, and I'm actually really impressed with how many scooter companies I've heard that are kind of doing this kind of consultation with vulnerable users group and trying to solve this issue. So that's very reassuring.
Great. So I think everyone, Nigel, has accepted it's an issue, and we've taken your point, and thank you very much for raising it. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Can I change, or Ed, do you want to just update me with anything that's on the chat line that you think we should bring up at this point?
Yeah, there's been quite a few comments actually, so apologies if I don't get through to read them all, but I'm just going to read one from Neil Holland. He says, the current trial scheme with Voy in Northampton, while drawing an element of criticism, has been largely positive. It is well used, and the County Council has worked closely with the police and operators in an attempt to minimise the issues. While it's clearly not perfect, the trial is useful in highlighting where work needs to be done to make them work in this county. One thing, however, that does not appear to have happened is that the use of private scooters has increased. The users presumably emboldened by the trial into thinking they're permitted to use them.
Yeah.
Which obviously covers a lot of the issues we've just been talking about.
So what Neil's saying there is that the trials themselves have spawned more use of private scooters. Is that that the point he's making there? I think it is, isn't it?
Sorry, yes, it does appear to have used, is that the use of private scooters has increased.
Yeah, because people see them, I guess, and yeah, interesting, very interesting. Anything else, Ed, at this point before I move on?
No, I'll let you to move on.
Before we move on, I would just like to add one point. Vicky, you mentioned as well that it would have been interesting to learn more from tried and tested solutions in other countries. And we were also addressing or wrapping up the question of were the trials rushed? And I think just to close that point of there are two sides to the coin here. On the one side, any innovation or experimentation that is introduced under crisis circumstances has a level of risk associated with it. And the risk is that you're doing something with only knowing 50 or 60% of what you're doing, rather than having 80, 90, 99% certainty of whatever you're going into. So I think on the one hand, it was a brave step by the UK to say this is something that we're prepared to implement, we're prepared to face the potential risks and work very closely with operators, work very closely with local authorities to try and mitigate those risks as best as possible. But we see that the benefits of a green recovery are more substantial and outweigh the potential risks that might come, especially if we partner with responsible operators. So this is one point. But on the other side, hang on, I just want to find Vicky's comment because it was making me think my point. Yes, on the other side, considering it's the first time the UK is having shared e-scooter trials, there is a wealth of knowledge that they can get actually from mainland European e-scooter trials and ongoing contracts. There's been 2 years, in some instances 2.5 years worth of experience with e-scooter in mainland Europe, and there's really a lot of information that can be funneled. And when something is done with such a short amount of time, there's very limited space and capacity to share those learnings across markets. And even if you can share those learnings, the time needed to digest what that actually means for your city is limited substantially. So, I mean, many of the local authorities did an incredible job of putting together both pre-tender and tender applications in a very short amount of time, processing a number of applications and so on. But in all of that, that's a lot of pressure and stress on local authority capacity, on the capacity of e-scooter operators, because it means that, for example, we had to apply to 20 tenders in the space of 2 or 3 months. So on the one hand, it does really promote innovation. It does promote experimentation, which are really, really good things. On the other hand, finding the right balance of how to learn as best as possible through that process, whether that means a slightly extended process rather than a very compressed process, that's something that the UK will now learn going forward.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much. I want to talk now about which modes of travel the introduction of e-scooters is most likely to have an impact on. So obviously supporters claim that e-scooters offer a greener travel option by reducing the number of people using cars, whilst those in the other camp might say there's a danger that they could replace walking and cycling trips. So Janelle, first of all, what does the history tell us from Europe?
Yeah, so here we've just completed a very comprehensive study across users in every single one of the markets that we're active in, which at the time of the study was 9 countries and 72 or 73 cities. So really a very large sample size that we did the study across. And we wanted especially to evaluate the changing mobility habits of people. And the outcomes of this was that 25% of our scooter rides replace a car ride, which is fantastic. So a quarter of every e-scooter ride could have been another car on your road, but isn't. And each e-scooter is only a 12th as space consuming as a car. So that's a lot of space that you're saving by having people on scooters rather than cars, but it's also a lot of CO2 emissions that you're avoiding. Yeah. Secondly, we asked how much are you replacing cycling with e-scooters? And cycling from A to B, an entire cycling journey, only 6% of cycling trips were replaced by an e-scooter ride. But over and above that, something that I find really interesting is that it's not that people have a finite amount of mobility that they can do. You know, people don't just have 70 mobility units and that has to be divided amongst different modes of transport. People are actually moving more because of e-scooters. So there's 4% additional usage that's happening that would not have happened if e-scooters weren't around. So people are moving more. E-scooters are replacing car rides substantially more than they're replacing bicycle rides. And the primary mode of transport complementing an e-scooter ride is walking. So we may actually be incentivizing people to walk more, Whereas maybe I want to go to the supermarket quickly. I just go downstairs, I get in my car and I drive to the supermarket. I get out my car and I walk immediately into the shops. But with e-scooters, I need to walk 300 meters to find the e-scooter. I need to park it somewhere at a special parking bay and another 200 meters to the supermarket. So there's maybe 500 meters extra that I've walked just because of taking an e-scooter rather than my car.
Okay, so you've told us there where 35% of the vehicle, the journeys come from. What about the other 65%, if my maths is correct?
So the figures I gave you are finite trips. The majority of our trips actually complement public transport trips.
So it's a mix of scooter and something else.
Exactly. So scooter and walking, scooter and cycling, scooter and public transport, or just a scooter.
You haven't got a figure for the number of fewer trips made on foot that would be made on scooter, on e-scooter.
I have to check with my research team. I will ping them now, and if they respond before the end of the conversation, I will let you know.
Because that's quite a critical question, I think, as I see it. I don't know what anyone else thinks, David or Graham.
Graham, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's clearly critical. I mean, that's really reassuring to hear. Was it 25%? Were coming from car journeys, and that's brilliant. I suspect it may depend on context, and maybe some countries are more amenable to where, for example, active travel is more common. I think it'd be one of the really interesting things that we're going to be looking at over the next year in the UK is where do these scooter journeys come from? How might they have otherwise been made if they had been made at all? They could be new journeys. My reflections really is that this doesn't happen automatically because we've already, bikes already exist, and we're always I'm frustrated that not enough journeys are by bike. So we probably need to be proactive about this, and we need businesses to kind of support the idea of e-scooters being part of people's journeys, and supermarkets to provide some kind of storage for them or docking bays if they're hire schemes. And also I think to put it in the context of other micromobility and other mobility services. So for example, you might one day use an e-scooter, a hire e-scooter to get to the station, take the train into central London. Combining those, then you may use a duct or doctor's bike to go around London, and so the idea of combining and trip chaining and so on is really, to me, a much more valuable way to look at it than just what do e-scooters replace or what do we combine them with. So there's a lot of potential. I just think we will see what happens in the UK.
Yeah. David, what's your view?
Well, it's very interesting to hear what Janelle had to say. The ITF published a very detailed report on micromobility, particularly on e-scooters, back in February, and that showed modal transfer across the world. In North American cities, where basically the car is king and there's not much choice, there was a substantial shift from car use to e-scooters there. Just about everywhere else, or most other places anyway, it was a much smaller shift from car. Paris was about 8 to 10%, and the survey that was done there. And you asked where the 65% comes from, and it's nearly all walking journeys. Cycling's not particularly affected, but then cycling's a small mode anyway. It's nearly all walking trips. Now, whether some of those get combined with e-scooter use, that's an interesting point from Janelle. But it is predominantly walking, which is abstracted to some extent. Some public transport. I think the trials will be fascinating. Because they were rushed and justified. The rush was justified, on the basis that this would provide an alternative to public transport.
Yes.
Again, I'd be really interesting to see what is found from the monitoring. But my impression is that the e-scooter users that I see in London, they are not old ladies or middle-aged ladies, if you like, with baggage shopping, going to Tesco's. They are youngsters who haven't got driving licenses, haven't got cars. They're not old enough, at least. So I hope they haven't got cars. They don't look like they're going to the shops. You can't carry passengers, at least not legally, on an e-scooter. So there are limitations in what they can offer in terms of viability, alternative offer to a car. So, I think, we need to learn, and we need to also adopt, so hark back to the rush of the trials, and I totally agree with what Janelle was saying. There's lots of information from around the world, experience, and the disappointment for me of the trials being rushed was that we didn't take the opportunity to learn and share that. You know, it is available, it was available, it could have been available, and I think it's interesting the pressure it's put on the operators apart from anybody else. So you know, there's lots more to be done. I think we're going to be very wary about adopting figures that relate to, as Graham was saying, you know, other places. You know, are they appropriate to York or London or Coventry? Everywhere is different, I would say.
Fascinating. There's a question on the chat that I want to pick up on, or it's a very short question. It's one I had on my list as well. Helmet or no helmet, says Rob Wilshire to panelists. I guess what he's saying is, should it be compulsory for people to wear a helmet when they ride e-scooters? Janelle.
Thank you. So Tier's position on this is that, again, on the lines of thinking of e-scooters in the same category as bicycles, is that there's a lot of studies out there around the negative impact on adoption of cycling by making helmet use mandatory on cycling. And the same will happen with e-scooters. The negative consequence over and above that is that it can actually economically cripple the industry. So we can stifle a nascent industry here by making helmets mandatory, and also we will seriously disincentivize use. So there has to be a kind of way up between how important helmet use is versus how important the adoption of the service is, and other benefits to it, so green recovery, alleviating capacity on public transport, and so on. And that's a question every single government and every single city needs to weigh up for themselves. We do see that the benefits are so substantial that they don't merit stifling it by making helmet use mandatory. However, we do also feel that it's the onus of the operator to do everything they can to make helmets available for people so that people can use them, so that people are incentivized to use them. So this is why Tier also has an integrated helmet box on our scooters that we've designed. It has a kind of foldable helmet. For COVID safety reasons, we've got hand sanitizer sachets in there, we've got hair nets. The helmet and the helmet box are cleaned every time we check our scooters and replace the batteries for fully charged ones, and so on. So this is something that in York is proving very successful. We're currently active in York and the adoption rate is quite high. And it's something that other e-scooter operators slowly are starting to think about as well. But generally, same what we were speaking about with the visibility vests earlier. You're going to disincentivize use, and there's no security that people are going to do it. And furthermore, who's going to enforce it? Is it really the best use of our police force's time and so on to be fining people who haven't got a helmet on an e-scooter, for example? It's very, very difficult to enforce something like that at scale. So again, cost-benefit analysis tells us that mandatory, no. Incentivized, encouraged, promoted, made available as much as possible, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Now, just before I come to Graham and David, we're almost out of time, but what I'm going to do with everyone's permission is run on for about an extra 10 minutes, because it seems to me as if there's still some healthy discussion going on. So I'm going to close the session at 10 past, latest I'll close it at 10 past 3, if that's okay with everyone. So David and Graham, back to you guys about helmets. What's your views? David?
Well, strongly endorse what Tier is doing. I've tried out one of their folding helmets and I think it's really cool and it's great providing that. Whether it should be compulsory or not, I think PACS have possibly said we're in favour of that, but what I totally agree whether it's realistic, whether it would work, and it will be a disincentive, no question. My concern is that just on the day that the ITF launched their micromobility report in Sweden, the Danish road safety minister, the roads minister, stood up on the platform and said they had monitored casualties in Denmark and found that e-scooter head injury rates were 8 times those from pedal cycles. So I do think there are some important distinctions between pedal cycles and pedal cycle injuries and e-scooter riders. I presume that's because of the nature of the upright position. You're pitched forward. Smaller wheels are much more likely to be thrown than you are on a bicycle with 27-inch wheels. So I think there are specific head injury risks with e-scooters.
Graham.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's one that's divided the cycling community to some extent. Whether helmets should be mandatory or not. I think I completely agree with the recommend but don't mandate, don't oblige approach, and that's what I'd recommend for cycling. Certainly, it makes no sense to me to oblige people to wear a helmet, and I would spend the money that I would need to spend on enforcing that on good cycle lanes, because that will increase cycle safety so much more than making people wear helmets. However, David's point is well informed by the evidence that I was looking over this morning, really, about helmet head injuries. And if there were some case that e-scooters head injuries were so much worse and it was so much more dangerous, then maybe there is a case, but I can't see that at the moment. So I think that's part of the trial, really. What is there evidence there that this is so much more dangerous than cycling? Therefore, it pushes into different territory in terms of helmet use. But until that's the case, until we've seen that that's the case, it makes more sense not to make them obligatory, because that might disincentivize use, which would get rid of all those other benefits. Excuse me. And if I could just come back to the walking journeys issue, I think that's fascinating, and I think it is a problem at first sight if it's young people who are not walking as much because they're using e-scooters. They're clearly not great for activity levels. But on the other hand, the e-scooters could be giving young people access to jobs and education that they might not otherwise be able to reach. So it's more complex, and we probably have to look at all these different social impacts.
I guess what we're going to find over time as the trials unfold, and then as they're legalised, is we're going to get the data to find out actually what's happening in the UK as far as trips are concerned. And I think that'll be fascinating to watch that going forward. Ed, anything on the chat line that we ought to pick up?
There's a similar question or about types of collisions that came in a little earlier, which I'm just going to bring back to. It's a question from David Boardman. He says, NHS data shows that there is a far bigger problem with single vehicle collisions than those involved in collisions with other vehicles. Due to the similarities with bicycles, don't you think that the casualty data will fare the same way?
Good question from David.
I mean, the answer is, unfortunately, at the moment, the casualty data doesn't tell you anything.
No.
They are not recorded in Stats 19, that wonderful system which we all know and love. That is under review, and I think in a year or two's time, there will be a category in the police reports for light-powered vehicles, which will include e-scooters. But as with bicycle injuries, where no motor vehicle is involved, they're often not recorded.
No. Anyone else want to comment on that one?
Yeah. So safety statistics is a very grey area relating to e-scooters across the world, because of this lack of standardization of recording them, recording incidents, recording the cause of incidents, recording the difference between a shared scooter and a privately owned scooter, for example, recording the difference between which type of scooter it is that has the most accidents, because there's certain vehicle design features that could also be contributing to a more safe experience or a less safe experience. And all those nuances currently just are not factored in. But what I can say is the most comprehensive study done so far on this was conducted by the ITF, published earlier this year, called Safety of Micromobility. And their findings so far say that e-scooters are not necessarily more unsafe than bicycles. And other studies that we have come across with regards to helmet use also show that mandatory helmet use makes a service a lot less accessible to members of lower income groups or of different racial backgrounds. So there's also a social dynamic and equity aspect and accessibility aspect that needs to be considered.
Okay. Graham, do you want to add anything to that?
No, but not to that specific question. Relating to helmets, we found that in our study of bike sharing Greater Manchester, actually, that a lot of people were deterred from using the bikes because they felt they should wear a helmet but didn't want to and didn't have access to one. And I put that down mostly to kind of the sort of barrier of the fear of traffic, really, that they perceived this was something that was dangerous and they should wear a helmet for, but it wasn't available. So there's quite a kind of complex messaging that's going on and possibly needs to be tackled.
Yeah, good. Ed, there's been 2 or 3 comments come back on the chat line. Do you want to just revisit them for me?
Yeah, we've got one from Keith Wheeler who says, are the police even going to attend a single vehicle RTC involving an e-scooter? No attendance equals no Stats 19 data.
Fair point.
And a second comment from Vicky Bristow is, the trials are exactly that, trials to iron out all these issues, and it's only the way to move forward. Graham's view regarding further analysis needed to compare injuries on e-scooters versus injuries on cycles is an interesting one. As we've heard constantly at the moment, we shall be guided by the science.
Can I just chip in on that? I mean, I think the trials are a tremendous opportunity to learn, but we have to remember the trials, because of the legal situation the government was forced into, as Janelle has indicated, they're only available for people with a driving license or a motorcycle license. Now, I know there's been a bit of abuse, but on the whole, it is. So the lessons we will learn will not be typical of the wider population if these scooters are legalised.
No. So just a quick one from me then. How far are we away from the point where privately owned scooters can be used legally on the roads? How long do you think it is? Within 12 months that privately owned scooters will be able to use, or longer than that?
But Janelle seemed very confident it'll be 12 months.
That's my ambitious timeline. I think somewhere between 12 and 24 months is feasible, because the DFT is using these trials to inform its positioning on national regulation. And I think this is also the first time an entire country is galvanizing to do simultaneous trials for a period of 12 months. And the data, research, learning demands of these trials are extraordinary compared to any other trial. Every single local authority is taking a different approach. Every single local authority has got different needs, objectives, benefits that they're trying to experiment with, learn from, learn how to drive behavioral change, and so on. So I think that the amount of data and information we're going to have at the end of these trials is just going to be way more than what we're actually anticipating. So the amount of time needed to sift through that all and make properly informed decisions is, it's going to be an incredibly interesting process, but I think a little bit more time consuming than what we're expecting. So for this reason, I would put like 12 to 24 months perhaps.
Fascinating. Well, unless anyone from the audience has got anything else they want to add at this point, anyone else to ask a final question, or anyone on the panel has got anything burning they want to say that they think we haven't covered, I'm going to close the session off in a minute or two. So can I first of all apologise for my dreadful timekeeping at the outset, my failure to log on to the, it's the first technical hitch I've had with the festival, and we're right at the, it's the one I was looking forward to most of all, this particular forum, and the one I was most relaxed about, and then here all of a sudden I couldn't get in, so I was like a rabbit in the headlights. But anyway, I apologise for that. I'm sure Ed did a good job of covering for me, as he does these days, and but I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us, first of all your attendees.